and you don't have a choice but to come to the table because we have a big dining room table kind of in the middle of the stage. So we're in this series we started at the beginning of August titled No Ordinary Day, and we've been talking about how Christ is present in the most pedestrian, ordinary, banal moment of every day. And not only is Christ present, but every moment of every day is thick with meaning. We just can miss it sometimes. So we started the series by talking about morning, waking up. We talked about the things we do in the morning, how to get our minds right in the morning. We made French toast for everyone. Maybe you had that. Remember that? You didn't want to miss that Sunday. And then after that, we talked about the conversations we have when we walk out the door and how our words matter, all of them. And then last week, we talked about our work day, or what we do with our day, and how Christ is present in our work. Well, that brings us to dinner time. And so today I want to talk about meals and how Christ is present when we gather and when we share a meal. So now academic studies have been done on what happens when people have dinners together with friends or meals together with their family. And we'll just start by talking about families. But when children, for example, whose families get together for dinner, they say, first of all, those kids will have higher grades, they'll have higher self-esteem, they'll be at lower risk for depression. This is all because of a meal. They'll be at lower risk for using drugs or substance abuse. They will be more healthy, they'll be less sick, and they're at lower risk for teenage pregnancy. I don't know how that's tied to dinner, but all of that's what happens. And there was now here's the one downside. The one downside is if you call your kids away from the Xbox at dinner time, then there is the chance they will not win you the $3 million next year in the Fortnite World Cup. All right, so that's the risk you take. There was one study done on dinners and kids, and they found this, that kids who ate at home, had dinner at home with their family at least 5 days a week, they were twice as likely to have A's as kids who had dinner at home with their family less than 2 days a week. Some people say that the family meal is the most important thing that you can do for the health of your kids and for your family. There's one family therapist who says it like this. She says, sometimes I'll be meeting with a family, and I'll just want to say to them, why don't you just go home, make dinner, sit down at the table for a meal instead of paying me for an hour? It's cheaper too, and it's probably better for you. When Jesus was here on earth, meals, dinners were a big deal to him, right? When you read the Gospels, you can't miss that Jesus is always on his way to a dinner, eating at a dinner, interrupted at a meal. He's inviting himself over to people's houses for a meal. Some say that Jesus ate his way through the Gospels. That's what they say. But meals, why did meals matter so much to Jesus? Because meals were a living manifestation of the kingdom of heaven coming to earth. And I say it's a living manifestation because for Jesus, they weren't just an icon. Meals weren't just a representation. They were the real thing in miniature. So when you think about how Jesus came teaching and preaching, he didn't come so much talking about ideas and presenting propositions. He came talking about dinners and who you have dinner with and who's invited over for a meal. I have this key idea on the screen, and this is kind of where we're going today. The meals Jesus ate always represented something bigger. They pointed to a new world, a new kingdom, a new perspective, a new way of life, a new way to go through life. So I wanted to use our time together this morning to talk about the elements of a meal and how Christ is present, but sometimes we can miss it. So I'll start with this. I'll start with meal prep, all right? If you're going to have a meal, it always starts with meal prep. I'm told today in America there are more than 3 million meal prep websites and Pinterest pages, I don't know anything about that, and Facebook groups, don't know much about that either. But there are millions of people interested in meal prep, but a meal always starts with a prep. Well, I have on the screen, as you prepare the meal, remember to agape. And you may be sitting here going, what in the world is that? So listen to this. In the book of Jude, well, in most of the New Testament letters, we read about the meals that the early Christians always had together when they gathered each week. And Jude says this, when he writes about the meals, he called them our agape feast. Now, maybe you don't know, in Greek, agape means love. He says, this is our love feast that we're having right now. That's how he talked about it. So that's why I'm using that word. For the Hebrew people, the meal was always a picture of God's blessing and love. It was a reminder that God loves us. The psalmist David, for example, reaching way back in the Old Testament, the psalmist David in Psalm 23, he says, you prepare a table before me, right? You prepare a table in the presence of my enemies. And then he goes on to say, and because of that, surely my life will be filled with love and goodness because you prepared. That's a picture of God's love. Then I have Song of Songs. King Solomon is writing about his bride, and he says he brings his bride into the banquet room, and there's this huge spread, and the bride says, when she sees this huge table, she says, it's like he has a banner over me that says love. When you prepare a meal, doesn't it say to the people who you prepare it for, you're saying that you love them and you care about them, right? But I think the meal is also, as you prepare your next meal, remember that it's a reminder of Christ's love for us. If you want to turn with me this morning, we're going to be in the book of Luke, and I want to start in Luke chapter 22. We'll be there most of the morning, and we read that Jesus is planning this last meal for his friends, and it starts with meal prep. I'll start at verse 8. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. Where do you want us to prepare it, they asked. He replied, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters. By the way, this is like Google Maps in the first century. Yes. Find the guy carrying a bucket of water and follow him. This is why people got lost in the 90s, when you used to write out directions. It never worked well. Anyway, and say to the owner of the house, the teacher asked, where's the guest room where we can eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there. And so they left and found things just as Jesus had told them. And so they prepared the Passover meal. I think a lot of times when we do meal prep, maybe we think it's a chore. Maybe when you do meal prep, you think we do meal prep just because we're hungry. I want to say no. I think the main reason when you prepare a meal, especially if other people will eat the meal, we do meal prep out of love. And Jesus knew this. And so when Jesus calls his disciples together for this last time, all right, he doesn't, and he knows, somehow he knows the Romans are going to kill him. But he calls them together and he doesn't give a speech. He doesn't read a manifesto. He doesn't say, let's march. He says, let's have dinner together. Because a meal was a reminder of Christ's love. And I think for all of us, our love is mixed into our recipes and ingredients. I have a potato and a potato peeler here because, my wife, I think, is like one of the world's best cooks. I'm sure I'm biased, but she's phenomenal. By the way, she even put together a cookbook for her daughter-in-laws. She said, Palmer, don't say that because, but it's amazing. I'm just going to tell you that. So as much as she loves to cook, the one thing that she tells me she does not like to do is to peel potatoes. Anybody here love to peel potatoes? All right, it's a pain in the neck. But here's what happens. So I'll ask, like on a Sunday night, I say, can I have a breakfast burrito? She said, well, I'll gladly make the breakfast burrito, but you need to go peel the potatoes because that's her least favorite thing, she says. And so I've gotten decent at peeling potatoes. I try to do it like as fast as I can just to get it over with. And the the peels kind of fly everywhere, but that's fine. Usually you have a sink and you're not on a stage and it all works out well. But sometimes I'm not home. And we will have invited our sons over. And she knows that particularly one of our sons loves her mashed potatoes with a sour cream and butter mixed in. And so even if I'm not home, she'll peel the potatoes, something she doesn't like to do. But then she said as she's peeling the potatoes, it reminds her of how much she loves her son. all of her sons and our daughters-in-law. And all of a sudden, you see her love is mixed into the recipe. I think for all of us, it happens like that. So the next time you do meal prep, can you just pause and remember Christ's love for you? But in this meal that you serve, you are spreading the love of Christ to all of these family or friends that you are preparing for. So once you've prepared the meal, right, the next thing that you have to do is to set the table. I don't know if where you're sitting, you can see that we have a whole table here. It's not set yet. We just have some place settings. And in my house, place setting was a big deal. You know, my mother was from the deep South, and so from a young age, like age 6 or 7, I knew that the napkin went on the outside, and then you had the salad fork next to that, and then you had the dinner fork next to that, and then on the right side, you would start with the spoon, and then inside of that was the knife, but the blade of the knife had to be pointed toward the plate because my mother would say, if it's pointed outward, it's a sign of aggression, like you're going to stab somebody with it. That's what they say down in Jackson, Mississippi, I guess. So anyway, but everything, it was like Emily Post at my house. She was very concerned that the table be set right. And sometimes, you know, she'd call me and I'd be doing something important, like, you know, playing video games or whatever it was, and she would call me to do it, so I'd do it in a hurry. I'd just throw everything on the left side or the right side, and she would call me back in the room, highly annoyed that I had not set the table right, you know. You can't put the spoon on the left side, Palmer. And I would say to her, I'd say, Mom, why in the world does it really matter? Because it's all just going to get messed up when we start to eat. She says, Palmer, if you don't set the table right, people will think we're barbarians. That's what she would say. And I would say, but Mom, we live in a bamboo mat house in the African jungle, okay? And that's true. And my friends, they had never even seen a fork. I'm not making that up. They used spoons, but usually the kids, there weren't enough spoons in the house, so they would eat with their hands, and they'd say, this is my spoon, S-P-O-O-N. So I like their whole plan of setting the table. It was a lot easier than at my house. Josh Havens talks about, when I was telling him what we're talking about, he said, at his table, by the way, before I say that, 1 second. So after you've set the table, right, sometimes you go outside and cut flowers. Veronica does that often, and sometimes she'll come back in and she'll be empty-handed, and I'll say, you didn't get any of the roses. She says, it's just buds out there. And I'll always say, have you tried the neighbors' houses? You know, are they really going to miss them? Come on. Will they know if they're at work or something? And anyway, once you've added the flowers and lit the candle, then we have a drawer where we keep the name tags. And she or we will go around and put the name tags at people's places. And people that come over often, like our kids and their parents, we just keep their names in the drawer. And then as you put them, it reminds you who's coming for dinner. Now, Josh, as I was saying, in his house growing up, he said they would always set a place at the table and leave it empty for dinner. And he would say, his mother and his father would say, it's a reminder that Jesus is at the table with us. And I said, well, Josh, wasn't that kind of weird? You know, just like, who does that? He says, no, I thought it was perfectly normal until I got to high school. I went to other people's houses and realized nobody else did this. But I think Josh's mother and father were onto something. I think it's a great reminder. The meal is that Jesus is invited to the table. And look at the book of Revelation with me. And this is why I say, as you set your table, remember to invite Christ. So John quotes Christ like this. He says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and have dinner with them. How do you like that? Do you see why I say that tables and the meal are a living manifestation of Christ among us? The New Testament Christians, the early Christians, they had these big, elaborate meals that Paul keeps writing about. And for them, every time they sat down, they insisted that people know that Christ is with us when we sit down for a meal. And I think sometimes we can miss that. I grew up Presbyterian. My father was a PCA pastor. And I've been in hundreds of PCA churches, and every PCA church up front looks exactly the same. You have a big looming pulpit. In front of the pulpit is a table, and the words are always engraved on the table. They say, "Remember me." Because that was one of the last things that Jesus said. He said, when you come together for a dinner like this, he says, remember me. And of course, 2,000 years later, we call it communion, the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, the Eucharist. And here's what we can lose sight of, because it's not always a big, elaborate meal. We can lose sight of that our meals at home, Christ is present. Of course, when we take communion at church, we're always reminded that Christ is present. But I don't believe for a second that God and Christ are only present in our lives and with us in a church building. And I just want to remind you of Jesus' words, that when you come together, just a few of his, with family or friends who love and follow him, he says, I am present. And so I say all that to say, the next time you set the table, invite Christ and remember that he is present and with us. And the question for all of us is, does he have a seat at your table? I'll say this next as we make our way through the meal. Once you've set the table and you've invited the right people, right, you always have to pour the drinks. And when Jesus was pouring the drinks, he was bringing to recollection for everyone, what every Hebrew person knew is, or Jewish person knew, is that the cup was a blessing. So I want to say this morning, the next time you pour drinks, whether it's water or milk or whatever your family drinks at dinner or iced tea, remember that you're pouring a blessing. Let's go back to Luke chapter 22, and we read this. When Jesus had taken a cup and given thanks, so he takes one cup, he said, take this and share it among you. And this was their tradition. They would pass it around the table. Let's not worry about colds and things like that. And so he says, share it among you. And so they passed the cup around. It was a cup of blessing is how they thought about it. And maybe you haven't heard this, but rumor had it, or tradition had it, this cup that went around this Last Supper table with Jesus, some say that Joseph of Arimathea took it to England. How and why he took it to England, we don't know. But ever since then, people have been looking for this cup. In Old English, a big, large cup was called a grail, so it became known as the Holy Grail. And so people like King Arthur spent their whole lives looking for it, and people like Monty Python spent their whole lives, whole existence, looking for the Holy Grail. Why did King Arthur want the Holy Grail, the cup that supposedly Christ passed around? Because it was a blessing cup. King Arthur wanted the blessing for himself. He knew what the Jewish people knew, that when you pour a cup, you pour a blessing. The Jewish people had known for centuries that they were to be a blessing for others. For example, Abraham was told this, that God says, I have blessed you so that you will be a blessing to others. And that's how it is with all of us. In the Psalms, Psalm 23, verse 5, David says this, he says, my cup overflows. Or in the Message Bible, it reads like this, my cup brims with blessing. You see, the cup becomes God's icon or God's reminder that he blesses us. Maybe you're here this morning and you have been pouring out into the lives of others. You've been blessing your friends and your family, your sons and daughters, your wife or your husband. Maybe you've been pouring out at work and you feel like your cup is empty. I want to remind you that this morning, the same cup that Jesus filled and passed around the table, that cup is for you. That cup of blessing. So pray this short prayer. God, Christ, fill my cup. It's empty today, but he can fill it. Fill my cup. I leave that prayer with you. I have one last dinner invitation that I want to share with you, and it's this, that as you sit down at the table, remember that at Christ's tables, It's always open seating. At Jesus' kind of table, the seating is always open. Don't you love it when you go to a restaurant and you show up? This happens. You get lucky every once in a while and you'll say, hey, can I have a seat? And they'll say, it's open seating tonight. You just walk in and choose any table you want. It's quite the opposite when you show up and they say, do you have a reservation? Now, I don't plan that far ahead, so it's rare that we actually have reservations. And so I've learned lately, like in Chandler, Gilbert, Scottsdale, the wait time is longer and longer. We showed up downtown Gilbert not too long ago, and they said, that'll be 2 hours and 15 minutes. What am I going to do in Gilbert for 2 hours and 15 minutes? Are you kidding me? And so here's the thing. When the very nice hostess says something like that to me, like, you don't have a reservation, come back in an hour and 45 or whatever, I'll say, hey, I see an empty table there, and there's an empty table there. I said, how about you just seat us there? Let's not worry about everyone else waiting over here. And they'll say, well, those tables, have they told this to you? Those tables are reserved. So then I ask them, well, what time are they coming? Now, they're not used to this kind of inquisition, but they'll look at their thing and say, oh, they're coming at 7 o'clock. And I go, well, shoot, good. It's only, 6:10 right now. We'll be out of here in 45 minutes like that. It never works. They say, we don't play those games. We don't roll like that. They don't like my help at all. Veronica and I were in New York. I think it was our first trip together to New York about 8 or 9 years ago, and we're meeting some friends for dinner. And we had been told that there was this really cool, new, hip, vibey restaurant in Soho, right? So we tell our friends to meet us there, and we meet at the restaurant. Of course, we don't have reservations, and so we tell the hostess we need a table for 4, and she says, you should have made reservations, but let me go see what I can find. And she walks around, and she comes back, and she says, follow me. We've gotten lucky. So we follow her, and she takes us to a table, and she points for us to sit down at this table. Now, I'd never seen a table like this before. This was 8 or 9 years ago. It was a big, huge, like farm table that could seat 12, 15, 16 people. And she said, you can sit here. But when I looked at the table, there were people sitting at the other end of the table. I had never seen this before. And she wanted us to sit next to them. So I said, time out. Hey, can we just have a meeting on the mound over here? So I pulled her aside and I said, there's people already at the table, like she didn't know this. She said, I know that, but there's room for you. And I go, you know what? Can't we have a table just for us? She says, no, the only table open is our community table. I said, what's a community table? She said, people in Soho love a community table. It's a table where everybody just shares the table. And she said, you'll like it. It'll be a good dinner experience. I said, okay. The Philistine from Arizona, the Zoni, finally sat down at the table. And she was right. We got to know the nice people sitting at our table, or we were sitting at their table. I don't know which one it was. And by the end of the meal, one of the women that was with us said this. She said, I feel like I'm sitting at the head table at a wedding reception. How do you like that? And that's what it's like. Maybe the hipsters of Soho are onto something. I think they are. I think they got it right. Because their tables are a lot like Jesus' table. Jesus always made it clear that everyone and anyone is welcomed and wanted at my table. You see, when Jesus came on the scene 2,000 years ago, roughly, the Jewish people had very strict ideas about who they could and could not eat with. They had a lot of regulations around eating and the dinner table. Jews would only eat with other Jews. Jews would not eat with people of a different nationality. Jews would not eat with people of a different race. Jews would not eat with people of a different religion, people that looked or talked different than them. Jews would only eat with other holy Jews. And then Jesus comes along and he starts to turn their table traditions upside down. And Jesus is eating with everyone and anyone. There's no one. When you read the Gospels, there's not a single invitation to dinner that Jesus turns down. And his table manners, some say his table manners were so offensive to the other Jews, that's why they wanted to kill him. Some people say that. We read this in Luke chapter 5. Verse 30, Jesus says, he's asked by the Pharisees, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? They're offended by this because his tables, it was always open seating. Jesus' tables were places of non-distinction. Jesus' tables were about diversity for everyone and anyone. Jesus' meals and his tables settled once and for all who God is for. God is for everyone, and so should we. And that's why this church is for everyone. Jesus' favorite kingdom metaphor, like I said a few minutes ago, was a big dinner table, but a kind of dinner table where everyone finds a seat at the table. In the book of Matthew, we start reading about a dinner that Jesus is talking about. He's using this as a parable. Matthew 21:1, the kingdom of heaven, he says, is like a king who prepares a wedding banquet. And then in Luke, we have a parallel passage, and it reads like this, Luke 14. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servants to tell those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. Verse 21, then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servants, go out quickly into the streets and alleys in the towns and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. Sir, the servant said, what you have ordered has already been done, but there's still room at the table. Then the master told the servant, go out to the roads and the country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. Do you see why I say Jesus' table are places of diversity? Jesus' table, it was always open seating. When you read about the New Testament Christians and the early church and their meals together, Paul describes the most interesting guest at the table. You read about slaves sitting at the table next to free people. You had Jews sitting next to Gentiles. You had Romans sitting next to Greeks. You had women sitting next to men. People had never heard of a dinner like this. People had never heard of a meal like that. But that's what Jesus' tables were like. At the Grove, we have these large dining room tables around the room. And if you've been here for any length of time, you've heard me say, we put them here so that everyone who walks through these doors will remember the kind of table, the kind of kingdom that Jesus wanted to bring from heaven to earth. I have this kind of statement that sums it all up. Jesus shows us a kind of meal, a kind of kingdom, a kind of church that transcends race, nationality, immigration status, or any other factor. This message, this text, what we're talking about right now is central to our identity at the Grove. That our tables and this church is for every person of every race, of every background. Every person is worthy of dignity and respect and has honor and value in the sight of God and all of us, regardless, like I just had on the screen, of nationality or ethnicity or race or any other factor. And so today, as you come in just a few minutes to take communion here, I hope that our communion today and every time we take communion serves as a reminder to you that Jesus' tables are for everyone. Because as we share at the Lord's table, that no one gets a better table, no one gets a better meal. We all share the same meal with Christ. Think about it like this. Around the world, today, on Sunday, around the world, Christians gather all over. You have Guatemalan farmers gathering. You have Oxford professors, Hong Kong executives. You have India's Delete the Low Caste. All come to the same Lord's table, and we are one. No one is better than the other. No one is more welcome or less welcome than the other. They are all wanted in the kingdom of God, and they are all wanted at this church. So would you stand with me? And as we go into this time of communion, I want to remind you of this, that Jesus takes this bread and the Jewish people called it matzo, and he breaks it, and he says, "This is my body broken for you." And maybe as you had never thought about it this way, this was called their freedom bread, or their Passover meal was called their freedom meal. And now Jesus is taking their meal, and he says, "But when you eat this bread, remember me." He says, "I am your freedom meal. I am your freedom bread." And then he takes the cup, and he says, "When you drink from the cup," he says, "remember me. Remember my blood that was shed for you. It washes away your sin. Remember your freedom from sin."